How's it going, everybody? In this video, we're going to be talking about what exactly is martial law. With the growing concerns going around right now, not only within the US with the virus, but also worldwide, we're hearing the term martial law thrown around a lot. And so my goal with this video is to give you some context behind what exactly is martial law, and historically in the US, when has martial law been used? So first and foremost, what exactly is martial law? Like, what is the definition of martial law? So martial law is the use of direct military control over civilian functions by the government. And historically, martial law is used in direct response to a temporary emergency, whether it is a disaster which is taking place or in a time of some sort of military insurrection or some time of war where martial law or the federal control and use of military is necessary. So who exactly can declare martial law? So at a federal level, the individual that can declare martial law is the President of the United States. As the head of the executive branch and as the commander-in-chief, the President has the authority to declare martial law. However, there's a caveat with this. Since Congress has actually been granted the ability to suspend the writ of habeas corpus under the Constitution, there's a debate whether Congress must approve an action of the executive in declaring martial law. So there is some scholarly debate whether the commander-in-chief can actually declare martial law without the express approval of Congress. And generally, approval by Congress has been determined either expressly, whether Congress expressly says, yes, we are approving the action of the executive in declaring martial law. Also, in some scenarios, we have seen where actually inaction by the Congress can serve as approval of the martial law declared by the executive branch. However, there are also situations where the legislative branch, where Congress can actually expressly reject the use of martial law, and this leads to a kind of power struggle between the two branches, the executive and the legislative branch. But generally, the individual who has the authority, and historically the individual we have seen who has the authority to declare martial law, is the President of the United States as the commander-in-chief. So at a state level, the individual who has the power to declare martial law is the governor. And a lot of times you see in various state constitutions, they declare that as the head of the state, the governor has this power. However, in 2007, there was this interesting development where Congress pushed forward this bill and George W. Bush signed this bill. And this bill is called the John Warner National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2007. In addition to allocating specific funds to war efforts, because then we were at war, the bill also gave the president and the executive the ability to take control of specific state national guards without the express authorization of the governor. So as we stand right now, the executive branch can actually call forward the state national guards without the express approval of a state governor. So now let's look exactly what does the Constitution say about martial law. So expressly, the Constitution does not specifically state martial law or contemplate something exactly by the term of martial law, but there are some sections within the Constitution that contemplate some of these concepts that have been incorporated into what we consider to be martial law. And these two sections of the Constitution that people specifically look at are Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution and Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution talks specifically about habeas corpus and the writ of habeas corpus. And Article 1, Section 9 states, the privilege of writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So under the Constitution, it is stating that Congress has the ability to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And this is also where we talked about how Congress kind of has a hand at approving martial law. And when the executive takes action declaring martial law, there's an argument that Congress must approve this because martial law and the writ of habeas corpus kind of go hand in hand. So for you to effectively declare martial law, you must have the approval of Congress suspending the writ of habeas corpus. And so next, Article 1, Section 8 states, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. So again, this is kind of an express stated ability of Congress and why Congress needs approval, because the Constitution contemplates that Congress has the ability to call forth the militia to repel invasions and suppress insurrections, so civil unrest. So some of you might have heard me say habeas corpus or a writ of habeas corpus, but you do not know exactly what that is. So what is a writ of habeas corpus? What is habeas corpus? So generally, habeas corpus is a concept of law stating that you cannot be held, or a person cannot be held by the government without a rationale or reason for you being held. it would fly in the face of the Constitution if a local agency or the U.S. or any aspect of the U.S. was able to imprison you without an express reason for doing so. It's what makes us a civilized nation, that you have to have a reason to arrest someone or to imprison someone. And since you have a right to not be held without a reason, a writ of habeas corpus is actually a legal action. And so the writ of habeas corpus is actually still used now by individuals who are imprisoned who petition the court stating that they should be released because they are improperly being held or improperly being imprisoned. And so a writ of habeas corpus is actually used when a court grants a writ of habeas corpus. They are essentially stating that the agency must release this individual because that individual is improperly being imprisoned. And it also is used stating that the agency must produce that individual who's being imprisoned and express a rationale to the court why that individual is being imprisoned. And so why the writ of habeas corpus and why habeas corpus interplays with martial law is when habeas corpus is suspended, either the federal government, a state government, or whatever agency is able to imprison someone without actually having a rationale to do so. They don't have to produce a rationale for your imprisonment. And it allows them to hold an individual without a charge. And this is why it is often equated with martial law, because they kind of go hand in hand. And so next, let's turn to the historical aspect of martial law and when it's been used in the US. And so there are two major distinctions. There are martial law and calls upon martial law when it has dealt with times of war. And historically, martial law has been used in the past to deal with domestic disorder. So the US has used martial law in various ways, specifically addressing with times of war. And the most cited example of this is when actually President Lincoln used and declared martial law during the Civil War. And so on September 15th of 1863, Lincoln imposed congressionally authorized martial law. And this authorizing act allowed the president to suspend habeas corpus throughout the entire US. And specifically, President Lincoln imposed the suspension of habeas corpus to prisoners of wars, spies, aiders and abettors, to the Confederacy, and he also applied the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus to any draft dodgers. So President Lincoln's action was actually challenged in a case called Ex parte Milligan. And so in a quick summary of what actually happened in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the president's use of martial law was improper in this scenario. And the imposition of martial law by suspending the writ of habeas corpus was actually unconstitutional. And so factually, this case dealt with an individual named Lambden Milligan who was arrested and imprisoned for being a Confederate sympathizer, and he was actually convicted to death by hanging. And so Milligan was not actually tried by a specific court, but instead he was tried by a military tribunal. And so after the fact, Milligan petitioned the Supreme Court to decide whether he was properly imprisoned. So ultimately what the Supreme Court had to decide is, and so what the Supreme Court actually had to decide is whether the military commission who convicted Milligan actually had the legal power and authority to try and punish him. And ultimately what the Supreme Court decided and ruled was no, that the commission did not have this authority. And so what the Supreme Court ultimately said is that martial law destroys every guarantee of the Constitution, and that civil liberty and this kind of martial law cannot endure together. But the Supreme Court here did not actually say that martial law can never be used. Instead, the Supreme Court stated that martial law can be used by the president in specific scenarios. The Supreme Court stated that when civil authority cannot operate, then martial law is not only constitutional, but would be expressly necessary. But what they state is that martial law or martial rule can never exist where courts are open. So we just talked generally about when martial law applies to actually times of war. Now let's pivot to when martial law applies to domestic disorder and when historically the US has used or the executive has called upon martial law to deal with social unrest. And so the first historical moment where we saw our concept of martial law used was actually by President Washington. And so this actually occurred when President Washington called forward state militia and essentially used them for federal service to quell the whiskey rebellions. And so the next most significant historical moment where we saw this concept of martial law get bounced around is actually dealing with the San Francisco earthquakes in 1906. And so what actually occurred in San Francisco is we had troops that were stationed in the area were actually called forward. Dynamite was confiscated and troops were stationed around and essentially ordered to shoot anyone who was looting. And also troops were stationed around various docks to protect the docks. Although in San Francisco no express declaration of martial law was called by the governor or anyone in the area, it is still cited as a express case of martial law because troops were expressly called into service and were essentially shooting individuals and told to shoot individuals, and essentially took control of this area. So after the San Francisco earthquakes in 1906, the next most historical event where we saw martial law play out was actually dealing with the attacks on Pearl Harbor. And so what actually happened is Hawaii was expressly put under martial law after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. And so essentially what happened in Hawaii during this time was a military government was established out of fear of what was going on in the recent attacks. After that time, after World War II passed, we saw martial law pop up a lot with the desegregation efforts. For example, in 1957, Governor Faubus of Arkansas employed the National Guard, or called upon the National Guard to actually fight against the desegregation efforts. And so then what actually happened is President Eisenhower then called upon federal troops and actually went into Arkansas, and then he took control of the National Guard and actually instituted this sort of like martial law, or what we envisioned to be martial law control, where the actual federal troops and National Guard troops went into this area and stopped what exactly was going on. And so I'm not going to go specifically into all the desegregation issues where martial law was contemplated, or when martial law-esque things took place, but we had President Kennedy in 1962 use it, and we also had President Johnson in 1964 and 1965 use federal troops to actually aid in these desegregation efforts. And so the last most recent historical event that we're all aware of when martial law came into play was when Hurricane Katrina actually came in and demolished New Orleans and the various areas. And after the fact, this area was called into martial law. And actually, so the state of Louisiana doesn't have something specifically called martial law, but instead they call it a state of public health and emergency. And so the state of emergency actually allowed the governor to suspend certain laws, order evacuation, and limit the sales of specific items such as alcohol and firearms. So historically, the most recent one dealing with Hurricane Katrina is the most relevant for us. As we see right now dealing with this virus, we have various state governments calling for the state of emergencies. We see nationally a state of emergency being declared, and we're seeing a lot of various efforts to not only limit sales, just like we saw during Katrina, but also limit specific sales of items like alcohol, like firearms. We're seeing a lot of various cities, not only in the state of California right now, but nationally, trying to limit the sale of firearms, limit the sale of ammunition, shut down specific businesses because they're considered non-essential. So I would say we don't have to look very far in our history to find the most relevant application to how things could potentially play out with the virus going around. Now, ultimately, my hope is that we never have to resort to either, and here in the state of California, resort to specifically some sort of martial law, or even naturally resort to some sort of martial law. My goal always with these videos is to give you guys some sort of knowledge behind various issues. For example, here, martial law. So if something is thrown around, if you see something pop up relating to martial law, you have some sort of basis and some sort of knowledge to talk about the subject. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and leave those down in the comment sections below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability, but right now I get so many comments, so I try to stay in there as much as I can, but I can't always get to every comment. If you guys like this video and you like what I've been doing on the channel, the best way you can support the channel is to join my Patreon. I'll put a link down in the description to my Patreon channel. Also, you can support the channel by using the various affiliate links down in the description. So as always, thanks you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, a nation that draws a great distinction between its scholars and its warriors will have its laws written by cowards and its wars fought by fools.